On December 8, 1980, tragedy struck the music world when John Lennon, one of the most beloved and influential musicians of all time, was murdered outside of his apartment in New York City. It was a senseless act of violence that shook the world and left many devastated. Lennon was returning home from a recording session when he was approached by Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old who had been stalking Lennon for months. Chapman was armed with a revolver, and he fired 5 shots at Lennon, 4 of which hit him in the back and shoulder. Lennon was rushed to the hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival. It was one of the most shocking deaths of all time, especially of an artist. No one saw it coming. Everyone asked the same question: why? And in today's episode of Behind the Date, we will ask that very same question. We all know John Lennon. Actually, the world knows John Lennon. He was a singer, songwriter, and peace activist who rose to fame in the 1960s as the co-founder of the Beatles, the most famous band in the world. John Lennon was born the son of Alfred and Julia Lennon, who separated when he was young. As a child, Lennon was highly creative and poetic, learning to play the banjo and piano and writing stories at a very early stage. He even formed a band called the Quarrymen, and during one of their performances he met Paul McCartney, who he invited to join the band. Together, they formed the band Beatles with George Harrison, which would later be joined by Ringo Starr. Not soon after, they released their first album in 1963, and the rest is history. The Beatles were an instant success, and their music revolutionized the rock and roll scene. They quickly became the most popular band in the world, selling millions of albums and touring around the world. As the Beatles were becoming famous, John Lennon married Cynthia Powell, and the couple had a son, Julian. In 1968, John and Cynthia divorced, and John married Yoko Ono, who would remain with him until his death. John Lennon was also a passionate activist for peace, and his influence was felt all over the world. He attended anti-war protests and wrote songs about peace and love, including and Imagine. But I'm not the only one. The latter of which is still played in peace concerts around the world. In 1970, the Beatles disbanded, and John Lennon and Yoko Ono moved to New York City, where he continued to write and record music. In the 70s, he released several solo albums, some of which were also big commercial successes. Life was going good for Lennon until that unfateful night, until Lennon met David Chapman. After the murder, David Chapman didn't run away. He sat down on a bench nearby and read the book Catcher in the Rye, waiting for the police to arrive at the scene. Once they came, the police swiftly arrested Chapman, who showed no sign of resistance. It seemed like Chapman knew exactly what he was out to do that particular evening. During his trial, Chapman claimed to have been inspired by the book Catcher in the Rye, which he had been reading at the time of the shooting. It is a novel by J.D. Salinger, where the protagonist is an angry, disaffected teenager who is tired of the phoniness of the world. Chapman identified strongly with the character and believed that Lennon was a phony and a fraud, who on one hand said to the world that material possessions don't matter, and on the other hand, himself lived a lavish lifestyle. Chapman also vehemently disagreed with Lennon's statement that Beatles is more famous than Jesus. He perceived Lennon to be supremely arrogant, to even subscribe to such thought, and according to his moral standards, that's equivalent to a death sentence. Yep, you heard it right. Also, we will detract here a bit and say that it was not only Chapman who was offended by this particular statement. You see, in March 1966, John Lennon made that controversial comment in an interview with Maureen Cleave of London's Evening Standard, where he said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I will be proven right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." The whole radio stations stopped playing Beatles songs, and their concerts were canceled in some cities. The remarks were seen as being especially offensive in the Deep South, where white supremacist groups burned Beatles effigies and created ads denouncing the group. The Beatles ultimately had to apologize for the remark, though Lennon himself later retracted it. While white supremacy and radical Christians did boycott and burn. No one went as far as hurting the man, well, except David Chapman. It was later understood that probably David didn't just act the way he did, just because Lennon offended Christianity. It is also possible that Chapman was motivated by a desire for fame and recognition. He had read extensively about famous assassins in the past, and he likely wanted to achieve a similar level of notoriety. He had been stalking Lennon for weeks before the shooting, hinting at the possibility that he wanted to be remembered as the person who killed the iconic singer, and if that's the case, he was successful. The reaction to John Lennon's murder was intense. Fans were in shock, unable to process what had happened. On the night of the shooting, people congregated outside the Dakota apartment building in New York City, where Lennon had been shot and killed. They lit candles, held vigils, and sang Beatles songs. People all over the world mourned as Lennon's music touched many lives. In the days that followed, the impact of John Lennon's death was felt everywhere. From his hometown of Liverpool to cities around the world, people gathered to remember the man who had been a part of their lives for so long. The reaction to John Lennon's death, all his songs were played on the radio, and his albums sold in record numbers. His fellow Beatles members kept quiet in the initial stages, most likely due to the shocking nature of the news. But it was clear that they, grieving intensely, made a legacy together that very few can ever have in their lives. John Lennon's death also sparked conversations about gun control. Many people felt that if Lennon's killer had not had access to a gun, he would not have been able to end the life of such an influential musician. John Lennon's death was a tragedy that still resonates today. Fans around the world still remember him fondly and are reminded of the power of his music. His life and legacy are celebrated, and his death is a somber reminder of the fragility of life. The legacy of John Lennon and the shocking nature of his passing will stay with us forever. If you are interested in more such videos around famous assassinations, then check out our previous on the assassination of the most famous American of the 1960s, JFK.